Welcome back. We're going to, another kind of fascinating conversation is in store on after exoneration. Our data analyst, Fairleigh Sturges, is going to lead this panel. This is a topic that the Quattrone Center has been focused on for some time because it can be very easy for people who don't follow this field closely to think that once we've exonerated somebody, our job is done, right? We had the wrong, we righted the wrong. Let's all go to the bar and celebrate. And, just using my friend John Thompson as an example, one of the things that I learned when I started talking to John was because he'd been on death row, he hadn't been able to take part in any of the vocational training or other things that were offered to other inmates, because why would we spend those resources on somebody that we were going to kill? And after he was released, he wasn't eligible for any of the support structures or things that we heard Sharif talk about, because he hadn't done anything wrong. So why would he need those things, right? And so often exonerees get caught in this weird, illogical structure of having gone through the trauma of being incarcerated without any of the support systems that they need, and us thinking that we've done our job and we should all celebrate, and the job's just not done. And when you add the lack of a compensation statute in Pennsylvania, looking at you, Pennsylvania state legislatures, for the second day in a row, things can get really gut-wrenching and tragic. And so Fairleigh and a bunch of fabulous colleagues, including our exoneree colleague, Chris Thompson, Chris Turner, thanks so much for being here.
Thank you.
Are going to talk about that, and please take it away, Fairleigh.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. So the symposium thus far, we've heard some really great panels about factors leading to wrongful convictions. John has presented 2 panels about forensic issues. We've also heard about interrogation tactics that can push people to falsely confess, leading to wrongful convictions. We've also heard 2 great keynotes about the experience of wrongful conviction and life in prison. Sharif Kuzan yesterday spoke to us about all the issues with his initial investigation where he was framed and his freedom was taken away for so long. And Dan and Lester this morning spoke to us about some of their experiences being with incarcerated people in prison. Dan talked to us a lot about JJ's story, and the last video that we saw during the keynote was of JJ leaving Sing Sing prison. But this panel, as John mentioned, is exploring the question of what happens after that. What are the challenges and barriers to reentry for people who are wrongfully convicted? What needs to be done by all of us to protect the well-being of this population? And where do we go from here? So I'm going to briefly introduce my panelists today. Thank you all for joining us as well. And then we're going to do some brief presentations so each of them can showcase all the fabulous work and experiences that they've had. And after that, we're going to do moderated discussion. Questions from the audience will be welcome. So start writing them down as soon as you have them. We can incorporate them into discussion whenever we're finished with our presentations. So starting off, I'm going to start with Shawn, so she's right next to me. So Shawn Armbrust is the executive director of the Mid-Atlantic Innocence Project. She's been there since 2005. In this capacity, she works to prevent and correct wrongful convictions in the DC area, Maryland, and Virginia. And during Shawn's tenure, MAIP has helped free over 20 innocent people. And moving on to Jeff, Dr. Jeff Kukucka is a professor of psychology at Towson University. He's an active researcher whose work examines the causes of forensic science errors and the consequences of wrongful conviction. He has published many peer-reviewed articles and given invited presentations on those issues, including expert testimony, legislative testimony, and media appearances. Today, he's going to talk to us about his research on exonerees' mental health and their experiences of stigma and discrimination. Next, we have Amy, Dr. Amy Shlosberg. She is a professor of criminology and the department chair at Fairleigh Dickinson University. She teaches a variety of courses, including some on wrongful convictions, and her research focuses on life after exoneration with a focus on policy reform. And finally, we have Christopher Turner. So Chris Turner was born in Washington, D.C. in 1965, and he grew up there. He graduated from Calvin Coolidge Senior High School in 1983 and planned to join the U.S. Air Force. However, in late 1984, he was wrongfully arrested and charged with the murder of Catherine Fuller, along with 16 other co-defendants. Despite his innocence, he was convicted and sentenced to life in prison. Chris was released in 2010 after nearly 26 years behind bars. He is currently employed by the DC Public Schools, and since he has gained his freedom, he's worked hard to provide help and support for newly released prisoners. Chris is on the board of the Mid-Atlantic Innocence Project. They handled his appeal, and he's also on the advisory board of Free Minds, which is a DC-based group that supports creative writing projects for incarcerated men and women. He also works with Healing Justice, a national nonprofit that seeks to raise awareness of the harm caused by wrongful convictions. So without taking too much more time, I want to let our panelists get started. But thank you again for being here. We're so happy to have you. And we're going to start off with Jeff.
All right, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you, Haley, for that kind introduction. Today I'm going to give us a bit of an overview of the challenges that exonerees continue to face even after their exoneration, and what we are doing to address those challenges and how we can address them more effectively in the future. We know why we're here, right? There have been nearly 3,500 exonerations in the United States that we know of so far, and there are likely others that are likely to occur in the future. On average, those individuals lost 9 years of their life that they cannot reclaim. Now, researchers like myself look at these cases and we wonder what went wrong and how can we prevent this from reoccurring in the future, which for good reason has led to a lot of research into the contributing factors of wrongful convictions, many of which we've heard about this week, including things like eyewitness misidentification, questionable confessions, flawed forensics, and so on. And because of that research, we are making progress in this regard, which is, of course, good news, as evidenced by the obviously increasing rate of exonerations over time, as this graph clearly demonstrates. I want to be clear about something. Exoneration is a positive outcome, right? As John said, it's a happy ending. It's a cause for celebration. But it's not the end of the story, because as we'll see in a moment, exonerees continue to face challenges even after their release and are often not given adequate support by our states to ease their transition and ensure that they land on their feet. So while we're obviously delighted to see photos like these of men who have been exonerated, and the video of JJ that we saw earlier that, for good reason is very poignant, the question that one of my lines of research asks is, what's next? What comes next after these jubilant courtroom photos? Rather than having me explain it, I'm going to let an exoneree say it in their own words. The exoneree you're seeing here is a guy named Bill Dillon, who served 27 years in Florida for a crime that he did not commit. To quote Bill, he said, "Many people are shocked to learn that parolees who were guilty of their crimes have multiple types of state and federal services for them to access after release from prison. However, innocent exonerees have nothing." And in many states, that is still true. That if you commit a crime, you serve your sentence, there is a safety net waiting for you after your release. But if you're an exoneree who did not belong incarcerated in the first place, there's not that same safety net waiting for you, which is extremely paradoxical. As it stands, 12 U.S. states, including the state that we're all sitting in here today, do not have any compensation statute for wrongly convicted individuals. They open the door and say, "You're free to go. We wish you the best." Of the other 38 states, there is tremendous variability in the level and types of support that wrongly convicted individuals are given after their exoneration. There's a very good recent paper on this by Andrew Madrigal and Rob Norris, two researchers at George Mason University. In fact, Andrew is himself the son of an exoneree who became interested in this area and is now pursuing his PhD in that topic. In their most recent compendium of state statutes, it showcases how much variability there is between different states in terms of how much support we're providing for wrongly convicted people. I'll give you a moment to just sort of take this in. But of the states that offer compensation, 18 of them have a maximum cap on the amount. Many of them do not reimburse attorney's fees. Many of them do not provide a set yearly amount of compensation. And as we'll talk about today, money isn't everything. There are other vital services that need to be provided as well. Things like employment training, mental health counseling, health care, access to housing, access to education, and so on. A lot of these statutes also contain disqualifiers. Things like, oh, my slide disappeared. Oh, apologies. Things like if you falsely confessed to the crime, if you falsely pleaded guilty, if you were serving a concurrent sentence for another crime, those sorts of things can render you ineligible for this compensation. Now, for the next little while, I'm going to tell you about the research that my colleagues and I have done looking at the specific barriers that exonerees face after their release, particularly with respect to stigma, discrimination, and mental health. To that end, I want to highlight a few ways in which these statutes are inadequate. First, fewer than half of them offer employment assistance. Fewer than half of them provide access to mental health counseling, resources that we know well that exonerees would benefit from. In terms of disqualifying stipulations, false confessors, as you heard Chris Meisner and others talk about yesterday, are disqualified from pursuing compensation in many states. So to get a better sense of the different domains in which exonerees face discrimination, we've conducted a series of field studies to measure people's real-world behavior toward exonerees and how that behavior differs from their behavior toward other individuals. One of our first studies, we wanted to see if exonerees face housing discrimination. Housing has been described by some, including Amy, as one of the most pressing needs for an exoneree when they're released. They need a place to stay. And if a statute isn't providing housing, they're going to be left on their own to find accommodations. To measure discrimination against exonerees, what we did is we contacted over 1,200 Craigslist postings, and we sent them an email in which we posed as either an ordinary community member, a person who had been incarcerated for a crime that they actually committed, or a person who was an exoneree. So that blue sentence is the only sentence that we changed between these 1,200 emails that we sent to folks who were advertising a property on Craigslist. A secondary aim of this study was to see if discrimination depended on how the exoneree described themselves, whether they described themselves as exonerated, wrongly convicted, or as innocent. The first thing we looked at is whether they got any response at all. Our ordinary community member, our control group in experimental terms, got a reply about 50% of the time. Our parolee got a reply about 40% of the time, as we expected. And as it turns out, no matter how we described the exoneree, they were treated in the same way that the parolee was. Despite their innocence, they too were less likely to receive any response to their inquiry about housing. Then we took a closer look at the responses that they actually received. And in a nutshell, what we found was that the responses to exonerees were not only less frequent, they were also less welcoming. They were less likely, for example, to be told that the apartment was still available, even though they had explicitly asked in their email. They were less likely to be offered to visit the apartment and do a tour. They were more likely to be threatened with the prospect of a background check. This obviously provides a barrier to securing the immediate need of housing. What about employment? We conducted a similar study where we recruited a group of 78 hiring managers, people with experience in screening and hiring job applicants, and we said, here's a real applicant for a real job at a hardware store. And we gave them one applicant's evaluation to look at. Their resume was exactly the same. Their application was exactly the same. Qualifications, experience, work history, and so on, all identical. The only thing that was different is some of them had never been convicted before, and others were exonerees. They had served about 2 years for a crime for which they had now been exonerated. When we changed that one small detail in these applications, although their qualifications and other aspects of their application were exactly the same, their applications were rated less favorably. The applicants were rated as less trustworthy, as less competent. The hiring managers asked to check more of their references, and the hiring managers actually offered them a lower starting wage than their counterpart who was equally qualified for that job. This next study was our attempt to get a better sense of the mental health toll of wrongful conviction. So in this study, which we call the Exhale study, the Exonoree Health and Life Experiences study, we surveyed 59 exonerees about their trauma exposure, about their current mental health symptoms, and about other aspects of their life that we thought might be used to identify effective mental health interventions. At the time that this was published, just 2 years ago, this was the largest ever study of exonerees, a sample of 59 wrongly convicted individuals who, on average, had served 16 years for crimes that they did not commit. And I want to quickly shout out my friend Jeff Deskovic, who was really instrumental in helping connect us with exonerees and allow us to get such a good sample here. It probably comes as no surprise, but it is still obviously very unfortunate, that the majority of exonerees who we surveyed had experienced a multitude of traumatic events, both inside and outside of prison, both vicariously and personally. To be exact, 80% of the exonerees who we surveyed had experienced at least one significant traumatic event while incarcerated, with the most common experience being physical assault. But as you can see here, life-threatening illness and injuries, sexual assaults, etc., also highly common in this population. We then administered questionnaires to measure their mental health symptoms, and with the assistance of a clinical psychologist, we scored those questionnaires to ascertain whether these exonerees would meet the criteria for a mental illness. Nearly half of them showed a symptom profile consistent with post-traumatic stress disorder, and approximately half also met the criteria for major depressive disorder. About a third of exonerees met the criteria for both of those disorders simultaneously. Now, a secondary aim of this study was to get a sense of what factors were correlated with exonerees' mental health to identify avenues where we could potentially intervene. In this table, I want to point out a few things, okay? The first thing is the good news. The good news is exonerees who reported feeling more social support tended to have better mental health. Exonerees who reported less negative cognitions, less negative thoughts about themselves and the world and others, also tended to report better mental health. That information could potentially be used by psychiatrists, counselors, and so on to design effective mental health interventions for this population. The less good news is some of these numbers indicate that exonerees' social support tends to diminish over time. When they're first released, there's a rush of support, and that support gradually fades. But what doesn't fade, according to our data, are their mental health symptoms. Those remain equally severe, regardless of how long since they have left prison. Now, because these data highlighted such a dire mental health need among the exoneree population, we then conducted a follow-up study to see how successful is an exoneree when seeking treatment. Again, if a state statute does not guarantee an exoneree access to mental health counseling, they're going to need to seek it on their own. So what challenges do they face in that process? Again, we conducted a field experiment where we emailed 752 therapists, posing as either an exoneree, a parolee, or an ordinary community member. Here, example, is the screenshot from the exoneree condition. What we found is unfortunately what we expected, which is that despite their professional obligations, therapists discriminated against exonerees as well. The black bars on this graph show you the percentage of therapists that altogether ignored these emails. Compared to not only the ordinary community member, but also to the parolee, exonerees were less likely to receive any response whatsoever from therapists. Ultimately, only 20% of the time would the exoneree's email to a therapist actually result in a meeting with that therapist. One final study I want to talk about. As I mentioned earlier, many state statutes disqualify false confessors from seeking compensation. We wanted to get a sense of, in those states, if a false confessor is not guaranteed compensation, their only recourse is to seek it through civil court. How do civil jurors make decisions about how to award damages to an exoneree, and are those damage awards influenced by why the exoneree was wrongly convicted in the first place? So we had mock civil juries read about a case in which an individual had been wrongly convicted due to either an eyewitness mistake, made by someone else, of course, or by the exoneree's own false confession, in a case where there either was or was not police misconduct. So they either did or did not coerce the eyewitness or the suspect. We measured jurors' perceptions of how responsible the police were for the wrongful conviction, as well as how responsible the exoneree themselves was for the wrongful conviction. And what we found was that overall, when a person falsely confessed, even if they confessed under very obviously coercive circumstances, people blamed the exoneree more for their own misfortune. They saw the wrongful conviction as their own fault. As a result, those perceptions impacted not only their administration of punitive damages, but also their award of compensatory damages. In fact, when an exoneree gave a false confession that was given under relatively uncoercive circumstances, at least as perceived by the jurors, their damage awards decreased by about 90%. They only got about 10% of the money that was given to other exonerees. Now, I want to end on a somewhat optimistic note, which is that in my home state of Maryland, just an hour or two from here, we recently, after many years of fighting for it, with the help of many of the folks who you'll meet here today, we recently were able to pass a very comprehensive and research-informed exoneree compensation bill called the Walter Lomax Act, which provides wrongly convicted Marylanders not only with financial compensation, but also with the vital social supports that I've described. Things like housing assistance, job training, health care, college tuition, identification, and so on. That's my time. Thank you so much.
Next we have Amy.
Sorry, I'm just looking for my slides here. Don't see them. I definitely put them on there. Hold on. I scrapped my flash drive. Yes, Jeff was trying to sabotage my presentation. All right, anyway, if you don't mind, I'll start talking as you pull it up. My name is Amy Shlosberg. I am very, very excited to be here and honored to be amongst all these panelists and these other... Oh, there it is. I just saw it.
Oh, right there.
Yep.
Thanks, Paul.
And then slideshow is here. Okay, excellent. Okay, so I'm going to be presenting research that me and my colleagues have conducted over the last couple of years. Oh, microphone, sorry. Is that better? Yes. Okay, sorry. So I'm going to be presenting the research that we've been working on for the last few years, but I just want to give you a little bit of a history of the quantitative work that was done years before this that led to the reason to do this project. For several years, I had conducted research looking at the effects of compensation and expungement on post-exoneration success. And that's a whole other research project, but what I found, which probably not surprising to anyone, was that individuals who had a record expunged were more successful upon release. And in this study, success, because success can be measured a lot of ways, since it was quantitative, success was measured as post-exoneration offending, as measured by arrests and convictions. I also looked at the effect of compensation on post-exoneration success and found that compensation was statistically significant, however, only when an individual was compensated above $500,000. And at the time of the research, many people in the sample were not, in fact, compensated adequately. So it's not that compensation mattered, it mattered that it was adequate compensation. So that led to the questions of why. When you do quantitative research, you don't get as much information, you don't get the richness as you do with narrative. So for the first time, we started looking at this in a qualitative way. Just click this. Thank you. Okay, so I don't need to really spend any time here because Jeff did this already, which is excellent. So we already know the scope of the issue, but as Jeff also mentioned, it's unknowable. There's no way to really know the numbers, and the numbers are much, much higher than anything that we do know. Years of research have pointed out many challenges that exonerees face upon release, and many of these challenges are not much different than challenges that other releasees face after incarceration. Jeff talked about a lot of these already, but of course that would be stigma, employment, housing, reuniting with family, mental health, physical health, the list goes on, unfortunately. And this is difficult to study because, as we know, exoneree support services vary widely by state, and most states are simply not adequate at all in what they are providing. Some researchers have begun to look into positive changes in exonerees after release as a way to understand why is it that some exonerees seem to be doing very well after exoneration, whereas other exonerees are struggling more. And if we could maybe understand what it is that is helping the individuals who seem to be faring better, then maybe we can, help more people. Very briefly, the study included 30 semi-structured interviews, but we ended up excluding 4 interviews because the individuals were still going through the process of exoneration. So since they were not officially exonerated yet, they didn't really meet the inclusion criteria. So we ended up with 26 semi-structured interviews. A lot of this started by connections to my friend Jeff Deskovic. Thank you, Jeff. If you want to stand up again, okay. Yeah, you do. Thank you. And then, like most of this research, the other individuals we spoke to, a lot of the people, it was done through snowball sampling. Each interview was about an hour. About a little less than half took place in person at Innocence Network conferences or people that lived in the area where the researchers were, and the others were on Zoom during COVID. The incarceration length is average of 18 years. You could see the breakdown, majority males, and there's the racial breakdown, and then the charge breakdown. Unsurprisingly, we saw mostly people that were wrongfully convicted of murder, and that was closely followed by people who were wrongfully convicted of sexual assaults. The sentences ranged from 7 years to death sentence. 5 individuals in our sample were sentenced to death, and 6 individuals were sentenced to life without parole. So when we looked at the findings, I'm going to be talking about them kind of in the 3 buckets of the main findings, and I'll just talk about the different themes that we found within each. Before I get into some of the themes, I just wanted to start with a quote from one of our research participants, because this was a theme that came up again and again. Culture shock, feeling like you're in a foreign place, like you're a tourist in your own life. And again, this is not, I do a lot of work with people who are also incarcerated, not necessarily wrongfully incarcerated, and when they come home, they experience similar. So as I go through this presentation, I am going to highlight a little bit where we see the difference between exonerees and other releasees during reentry. So they open the door, kick you out, and say go. That was a quote. I pulled a few quotes just for the sake of time. I didn't put many, but I put a few just to illustrate some of these themes. Similar to, as Jeff mentioned, there seems to be this elation, a lot of support for exonerees within the first hours of being released. Sometimes it lasts longer. It's just shock. It seems that everyone wants to be there for you, is from what we heard. And then there's this paralysis when kind of the cameras go away and people get back to their own lives, and then you're left to pick up the pieces. Navigating the bureaucracy of everyday life. In the vast majority of interviews, people talked about the difficulty with just getting an identification card, because without an identification card, you can't do really much in our society. So getting a state ID card, social security card, other documentation. Financial and material challenges, mental health, and stigma. These are areas that we see anyone leaving incarceration, especially for a long period of time, is going to experience these. When we talk about financial areas, I will revisit compensation because it comes up in another pillar that we discussed. But this quote, I just wanted to read here. I don't know how you can calculate somebody's life that you took, but that's how they do it. And they issue it out to you the way they think you should have it. And so compensation came up in a few different ways. So again, I'm going to go back to that idea, but for now, I'm going to skip it. Stigma led into not only the stigma faced by individuals who leave prison, generally speaking, but the idea that somebody who's exonerated may have gotten released on a technicality. This came up time and time again, that there were individuals that said when they returned to communities, there were kind of two camps of people. One group that was supportive and, cheering for them, happy for them, believed them, and then there was another group that truly believed that they were guilty of something and it was the technicality, and they in fact were treated as if they had done something wrong. Reestablishing social bonds and societal and technological change. Again, these areas are also a lot of the issues that exonerees spoke about in the interviews were very similar to the issues that you see with anyone leaving incarceration. However, the reestablishment of social bonds, there were a few cases where the exonerees spoke about how if there were family members who didn't believe them, how it was tricky to navigate that. And most importantly, in the cases where someone was accused of harming a family member, those relationships became very difficult to reestablish as well. Okay, the second group of findings focuses on coping mechanisms and resources. The resources and experiences prior to release matter, and they matter a lot. A lot of research focuses on reentry services, but this is a broader issue, and it's come up in other panels, the issue of the lack of adequate services in prison for, again, not just people who are wrongfully convicted, but everyone who's in prison. And the exonerees who felt that they received strong programming while they were incarcerated, they seem to fare much better upon release. The addressing of immediate needs, that came up. And I don't think when I went into this research, I realized just how granular that was. A lot of exonerees spoke about they needed to get a toothbrush. They needed to get a new pair of socks. Women needed to get certain products. And just if they had family to pick them up, great. But then they realize, oh, wait, but where am I going to get this? Where am I going to get that? And all of a sudden it starts flooding all the things that are needing. So the addressing of just immediate hygiene needs is a big one. Compensation and expungement. Compensation for some individuals was almost a form of closure. But I heard time and time again, another theme that kept emerging is it was seen as an official apology. Whether or not there was an actual official apology, the compensation served, it was at least symbolic of an acknowledgement of wrongdoing by the system. And that did, of course, depend on how an individual got compensated. Individuals who got compensated through civil suits didn't feel that way as much as individuals who got compensated through state statutes. Expungement, and this was in my old research on expungement, I also found this, that expungement actually doesn't matter as much as we once thought because of the internet. So yes, if you run a criminal history background search, some exonerees have had their records expunged. Believe it or not, there are many exonerees who, if you do a background check, it'll say first-degree murder and rape, and then it'll say dismissed, as if somehow that's adequate enough. Instead of wiping the record clean, it just says the word dismissed. So expungement, if you're going to say a record's expunged, it should be wiped. But a lot of exonerees spoke about the issue. One exoneree I spoke to actually went to a professional data scrubber to get their information cleared off the internet because it was causing so many issues in his personal life, in his dating life, in his employment. So expungement, I think we need to start thinking about expungement a little broader and how we can work with, I don't know, the internet and figure out how to get, all of these old records, away, because that's a very unfair part of it. Social services, I think it goes without saying that exonerees need social services, including employment, housing, mental health support was a huge one. Some other areas that maybe weren't as expected, there was this focus on self-sufficiency and individuals talking about the importance of finding self-worth because, quote, because you lose it when you're found guilty and while you are inside a prison. When you come home, you need to find that self-worth. Restoration, the need for more agency for exonerees to be able to identify their needs and offer input for healing. I really appreciate at this conference there are so many exonerees, and at least we got to hear from one exoneree, another exoneree in a bit, because that's what's missing from a lot of the academic conversations is the people who have the lived experience. And without that, what are we doing? Going back to this idea of closure, I mentioned that some people felt that compensation was closure, but many more people felt that closure was not possible. This quote about closure, it's a bad joke that's been played on the victims of the crimes first and then on the victims of the injustice. So closure, it seems like that there is quite a myth surrounding this idea of closure. Engaging support systems, safe spaces to tell stories. Something I should have mentioned before, one of the huge limitations of this research and a lot of the academic research in this area is that the exonerees that we talk to are likely the exonerees who are faring well. So the data is extremely skewed. And some exonerees I spoke to even said, I don't want to be talking to you. I don't want to be doing this. Some people feel like they have to do it for various reasons, whether that be because they feel like they need to provide the information so there's a platform for this. Other exonerees do it for the compensation, because in these studies we do compensate participants, and that's the same as any participant, whether it be, if you're talking to teachers or students or exonerees, it doesn't matter. In my type of research, I always compensate individuals. So it did cause me to rethink this idea of, giving people money for their time, because for some people, it's actually it exploits them. And that's something that I've learned throughout this process. This theme came up time and time again. I'm currently working on a paper examining social support networks of exonerees. I'm sure every exoneree in the room can attest to this, but the importance of the networks that each exoneree has. If you've ever been to a network conference, then you also know this. So they talk about it's a connecting network. You feel like we knew each other for years, able to relate and connect with each other, sharing lived experience. People who have not been through it do not understand. Again, there's such a small population of individuals who have had this unique, horrific experience that I think the camaraderie and being able to share that experience has helped a lot of people, at least in my sample. Lastly, and this is an area that kind of emerged. It wasn't an area that it wasn't in our interview script. This just emerged, and it was the fact that we kept hearing stories of positive change, and this was kind of something new. There has been one or two other researchers that have talked about post-traumatic growth in far as how exonerees grow from the experience, but we wanted to look at it systematically. So we went back and coded all of our data using the post-traumatic growth inventory scale. And this is the idea of personal growth that is experienced following a traumatic event. And we found a lot of evidence for again, our sample, of which is probably exonerees who are faring well, they do seem to have evidence of post-traumatic growth. And I'm just going to share with you a few quotes that support that. I came out a completely different individual. I educated myself. I did my own time. I made the best of it. I came home a completely different individual. I am grateful. I focused on speaking, on being a motivational speaker. I focused on coming home, being a human rights activist. You're fighting to prove an injustice is done to you. You get a different mindset. You get a different set of values, your own set of morals and principles. And when I came out, I had a lot of energy, ready to burst at the seams, more dedication. And again, just for the sake of time, I'm not reading all of the quotes. Okay, so it's clear that there are unique reentry needs among exonerees, and there needs to be a holistic but individualized approach because not every exoneree needs everything. Some exonerees have a very strong family support system, some do not, so their needs are going to differ. Mental health, physical health needs, of course, differ by individual as well. Support is needed prior to release, and again, this is not just for people who are wrongfully convicted, but we need to think about this in terms of just, well, we need to talk about the issue of mass incarceration as we have been, but for now, if we're going to be incarcerating so many people, we need to do a much better job with how we're treating individuals who are incarcerated. So support is needed prior to release. Immediate and continual. One of the biggest shortcomings with existing compensation statutes is it's not immediate, and that's what's needed. There are some states that do have immediate emergency funds, but unfortunately that's not the norm. So I think at minimum there should be automatic expungement, and that should include someone who's technologically savvy enough to know how we deal with the issue of everything being available on the internet now. Adequate gate money and access to social services, at the very least, parolee services that are offered in the individual states. That should be at very minimum. And then continuing on, I'm very interested in what factors contribute to post-traumatic growth and how it changes over time. But again, this is almost impossible to do because you can't force people to talk to you. And the people that have the highest levels of post-traumatic growth are likely the people that are participating in the studies. I'm also interested in how exonerees differ from other releasees because we know that there are many issues experienced by anyone who's leaving incarceration. And I'm interested in the post-traumatic growth aspect and what's different between the two groups. Also, the theme of survival guilt kept coming up. And it wasn't only exonerees saying that, they felt the guilt at leaving behind other innocent people. A lot of exonerees just spoke about the family they made while they were incarcerated and that they saw the atrocities going on in prison, and now they need to spend their life working towards, abolition or doing something to help their family that's still inside. So currently we're working on a longitudinal national survey to further understand, and I'm hoping to get generalizable inferences about the exoneree population, but again, that's not possible because we don't know what the population is. But we're working on trying to do a large-scale survey that, because Jeff's survey, those numbers are very impressive, but I'm trying, maybe we'll do it together, but I'm hoping to, it's an area that's very much lacking in the research. Is we don't really know, we don't have a sense of, because the registry is saying over 3,400, and our samples, I have, almost 30, you have almost 60, so it's a very small subset of the population that we do know. Okay, thank you very much, and that is some of the publications from this line of research. If you're interested in the earlier studies I referenced, please feel free to reach out, and thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Very informative.
And while it gets pulled up, I'm also going to get started. Thank you so much to Jeff and to Amy, because this work is incredibly important. The work you guys are doing is incredibly important. And I think one of the things that really strikes me as I'm sitting here is that in the 25 years I've been involved in the Innocence movement, I think there's much more connection between legal academics and the lawyers doing the work on the ground. And so it's very easy for us to weave that research, weave the work into our litigation strategies. But once people are released, there's not that same connection between the researchers and the practitioners on the ground. And I think, what you're doing, and just being here today, and Quattrone Center having us all here today, is a super important step in that process of really starting to integrate that work so that it can benefit exonerees who need it. So I have, as I said, been involved in this work for 25 years. The first exoneration case I worked on was as a college student. I then had the opportunity to work as sort of like the kid at the Center on Wrongful Convictions at Northwestern's law school. And because I was the kid and not the lawyer, not the professor, exonerees and their families talked to me a lot. You know, I was kind of a sympathetic ear. I wasn't intimidating. People didn't feel like they had to fake it around me the way that some of my clients now maybe do. And I heard a lot of stuff that made me really concerned about the experiences exonerees have both pre and post-release. So when I was in law school, I published on the experiences of exonerated people and the need for holistic compensation. And I will tell you that even with that background, I was not prepared to do the work of an innocence lawyer and to do the work necessary to help people when they were released. So I think it's taken me years of practice to kind of figure out what you guys have figured out in your research. And my presentation today, frankly, most of it's already been covered. So what I'm going to do is kind of walk through, though, some of the things that make exonerations different from normal releases. Because, you know, I always talk about exoneration cases in the criminal legal system as square pegs in a round hole, right? The system isn't equipped yet to handle the idea that innocent people go to prison for things they didn't do. And likewise, the system isn't really equipped yet to grapple with the problem of people being released for things they didn't do. The services that are set up aren't set up for them. And so at each stage of the process, it's hard enough for kind of quote unquote normal prisoners who go through the system, but it's that much harder for exonerees. And so I want to walk you through kind of the whys of that. I'm going to skip a lot of it that actually relied on your research. So hopefully I will be fast and you will get to hear from someone who actually does have lived experience going through all of this. So this really overlaps a lot with the quote Jeff shared from Bill Dillon. And I think it illustrates just how common not only the feeling is, but the reality that when you are freed, you have nothing. So, you know, in a typical release, you have some notice that you're coming home. You've perhaps been granted parole and told that it's going to take 30 days for you to be released. You have a release date. Maybe you've been on work release. Maybe you have been in some kind of pre-release program where they're actually preparing you, making sure you have the necessary documents. That's not what happens when you're an exoneree. And just to give you kind of an example from practice of how sudden this can be, I want to briefly mention the release of a guy named Mike McAllister, who was freed in May of 2015. Mike had been incarcerated for 29 years for an attempted rape he didn't commit. And he was facing a lifetime of civil commitment as a sexually violent predator unless then Virginia Governor Mike McAuliffe pardoned him. And the governor had essentially a 3-week window in which to do this because pardon power doesn't cover civil commitment. And it was down to the wire. We had no idea whether he was going to grant it. We couldn't tell his family it was coming. We could tell them to be hopeful, but that is it. So one day I get the call, the pardon's granted. It was in the Washington Post 5 minutes after I got the call. And then I drove 4 hours to the prison where Mike had not woken up knowing he was going home that day. As I was driving, it wasn't even clear he was going to get to go home that day because of some issue with a fax. That's not important. But I couldn't even, up until an hour before his release, communicate accurately with his mom about whether her kid was sleeping at her house that night. So that is how sudden it can be, and that's not isolated. It's also oftentimes coupled with walking out of prison, which you didn't know you were going to do that day, to a throng of reporters and being expected to essentially participate in a press conference that would terrify most of us, let alone someone who's just spent the past 20, 30, almost 40 years in prison. So that's what happens when you're an exoneree. Again, once you actually get out as a quote-unquote normal prisoner, you often have something. It's not great. We don't do a good job for any of the citizens caught up in the criminal legal system, but you may have a pre-release program, you may be released to a halfway house, you have a quiet, private release, but not when you're an exonerated person. You're just sprung, and again, as Bill Dillon and an exoneree from one of our focus groups said, you have nothing. And they are released like this when they've actually, on average, spent more time in prison than your average prisoner. So almost half of prisoners in the US are sentenced to 2 to 4 years, and the National Registry of Exoneration, most recent figures from the 2023 set of exonerations, suggests an average of 14.6 years. So the amount of time exonerees are spending in prison on average is actually going up. And what that means is that it's going to be harder for them because they've missed more. And this is what we hear from exonerees. We've done a couple of focus groups with exonerees to sort of assess their needs. And then this is another quote. But, if you can imagine what's gone on in, let's say, the past 36 years. I'm 46. So since I was 10, I've graduated from middle school, high school, college. I've gotten married. I've had a kid. I have gone through lots of different types of technology. And if you are an exonerated person, you are walking out without having gotten to do any of that. So it really is just a total sea change that people have to adjust to. And again, exonerees have it harder than most people because they've served more time. So, Amy covered some of this, but just the immediate needs upon release, I cannot emphasize enough how truly basic they are and how difficult it is for people to actually secure those needs. So stable housing, clothing and toiletries, the day of releases, I'm sending out staff people buying underwear for random people they haven't met because they don't have that. They don't have toothbrushes. They may not have access for more than 7 days to medications, but of course, without an ID and without health insurance, you can't get those medications for more than 7 days. They may not have the documents you need to actually get an identification card. So it's incredibly difficult. And then you add to that everything in their life is going to be conducted on this little phone that, they probably at this point had access to some kind of cell phone in prison, but not the way we do now. So they have to navigate all of those things using technology that is hard for my parents, let alone for someone who's never had access. And then there's the trauma, which you guys covered very, very, very well. So I don't want to talk about so much of the research. We know that exonerees experience trauma at higher rates than even combat veterans do. So it's really profound, and it affects them in incredible ways that, again, just astound me every time I see another exoneration, the depth of it and the triggers that people experience. So just if you're a regular returning citizen, the way you can figure out in any room who has probably recently spent time in prison is they've got a view of the exit. They are along the edges. If you're in a restaurant, your back is not facing the door. Loud noises, sudden touching, bright lights, total lack of structure is really uncomfortable for a lot of our clients. So there's that 24 hours of joy, and then your family goes back to work, and you're just stuck at home all day with nothing to do. We have multiple clients who have actually rearranged kitchens in their houses and caused immediate marital trouble. But it's very real. And we also know that exonerees, or any person who spent time in prison, has worse physical health, largely related to substandard medical care, and also to just the stress of living through incarceration. All of the traumas Jeff talked about that people have experienced, those don't make you physically healthier either. And that's something that exonerees experience. So we know they have a really difficult time adjusting, but at the same time, we are not very good at dealing with it. My organization is a member of the Innocence Network, which in the US involves 56 organizations. Only 9 of us have social workers or other client support staff. That is an incredibly paltry number. And part of the reason for it is because, a really big year at an Innocence organization is freeing 2 to 4 people. So when you're approaching funders, it's really hard to say, hey, I need a whole staff position for the 2 people we might get out this year, when we're simultaneously saying we've got a backlog of 200 cases. So it's difficult to justify, but incredibly important. So, I'm going to talk about what my project is doing, but just quickly, there are a couple of organizations that are specifically devoted to exoneree support, but they also are small, have a hard time attracting funding because the absolute numbers aren't that high, and only have so much bandwidth. So, when you look outside the network, there are local reentry organizations that are terrific, but can help with the pieces of reentry that aren't specific to exonerees, but don't get at those pieces that go beyond the readjustment and the trauma that exonerees actually experience. And there isn't a lot of specialization in this area. So there are people now who are really starting to work specifically with exonerees. That includes people at Drexel, who have partnered with the Pennsylvania Innocence Project. But that is a huge gap that I think Jeff's research in particular is going to help us fill, because we really need people to take that on. So at the Mid-Atlantic Innocence Project, when I started 18 years ago, I was the only employee. And we had 1 exoneration. We're up to 44. So it becomes a lot easier to justify hiring someone. And we were really lucky that we had 2 clients who donated portions of their settlement money to us so that we could establish an exoneree support program. And that is not something they should have to do. But the reality, it's something that did have to be done. And so that allowed us to hire a part-time social worker who can't be with us today because her mom is in the hospital. But it allowed us to hire her to do a few things and really start tackling each of the places that Jeff and Amy identified as barriers. So the first is preparing for release. We've always struggled with the idea of when do you start preparing a client for release? Because if you start too soon, you're going to make them think it's happening. And you don't want people thinking it's happening. And so what we've done is just made a release plan a part of our litigation. So every client whose case is being litigated, we develop a home plan. And it doesn't make people feel like their case is special. So we've got those things in place, but we're also trying to kind of manage people's expectations and hope. She's also supporting clients after release. So just, the basic case management, making sure that they have the support they need. And then that third phase is really trying to figure out how to help exonerees address trauma. And that, I think, is really the hardest issue to grapple with, and something where I think there's a lot of room for partnership between academia and innocence organizations on the ground. Thanks to our second client's donation, we're now able to have a client support fund. So all of those basic needs cost money, and most of our clients' families don't have money certainly don't have money to outfit a new person in a completely new life. So we've been able to establish a fund that will allow us to help meet those needs. But it is really, it's been slow going, and I think the Innocence Network is catching up. It seems like there's a lot more research in the past few years that are going to help us do this in a way that's appropriately data and trauma informed. So I'm just really excited that you guys are bringing us together. And without further ado, I am being followed by one of my favorite people who I think will not only show you why we all want to do this work, because his courage and tenacity and frankly positivity are incredible, but also show you just how difficult it is. So thank you.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. Thank you all for coming out, sharing your time, being patient. Wow. Cannot thank Amy, Jeff, Shawn enough, as well as Fairleigh for this panel. This has been an incredible experience. My name is Chris Turner. I was wrongfully convicted for a crime in 1984, crime that I did not commit. It's the first time ever in America that 17 people were charged for the murder of one person. If you think that's crazy, you should hear the prosecutor's version that there were additional people that he had to charge, which justified why there was no physical evidence linking any of the defendants to the crime. And his concept was that there were more who got away that we haven't charged yet, but there will be a second trial. And that's something that you can sell to the public when you tell them that 17 black kids attacked and sodomized a woman from their neighborhood in front of 2 banks in broad daylight in a business district. To give you the perspective, you just think out here on Chestnut in broad daylight during rush hour, and there are no outside witnesses to this crime on the 1st of the month. I know you have a lot of people, not many in this room were born in 1984, before during that time, or know about, this is before electronics. This is when you had to physically go to the bank on the 1st of the month and cash your check. You had to physically go to the grocery store. There was no Uber Eats, so people were there physically going about their daily business on the 1st of the month. So this place was normally busting at least maybe 500 people or better, maybe thousands of people going through the travel. Also, high school kids wasn't driving then, so we would be on the bus transferring. So it's the #1 bus transfer location for people going throughout the city. But there were no outside witnesses to this case. As a result, I spent 26 years in maximum security prisons all over the world, and I wouldn't shut up about it, so I was given what's called diesel therapy. So I was transferred on 18 different occasions to prisons from Pennsylvania to California to Alabama to Florida, Indiana, Kansas, Arizona. Diesel therapy is called diesel therapy because you're going on a plane or a bus somewhere, and it didn't matter. But the good thing about this is it did not shake me. It actually strengthened my fight. At one point in time, I was at the lowest point in my life. I didn't care if I lived or died. I thought my situation was the worst situation in the world. I was in solitary confinement my first 60 days in the federal system was spent in solitary confinement. Out of the first 60 days, 42 of my first 60 days was spent in solitary confinement. And I had the privilege of reading a book called Coffee Boy, dealing with the atrocities in South Africa during apartheid. And this book would change my life forever. As bad as I thought my situation was, because as our distinguished MC has told you, I graduated from high school, I was going to the Air Force. What you didn't know is that I grew up on Capitol Hill, literally on Capitol Hill. I rode my skateboard inside the Capitol. I played hide and go see in the Supreme Court bushes. I swam in every fountain in front of the White House, reflection pool, you name it, that's what we did as kids. I literally came from Capitol Hill. And you don't think this is supposed to happen to a guy who goes through school, never had a criminal record, graduates, does the thing, active in his community. This isn't supposed to happen. But I'm here to tell you, and I'm living proof that it did happen. So I tell you about that book because that book changed my transformation. It was when I read that book that I found out, as bad as I thought my situation was, it was not the worst in the world. It wasn't in the top 10,000 situations. So I began then and there to make that transformation, to make that place my modern day Timbuktu, a place of higher learning. You had a choice to make it your monastery, or either you're going to make it a place of higher learning. And when I made it a place of higher learning, I found out that I love reading books. And so I read everything I could get my hand on. I was still in solitary confinement because my attitude wasn't right yet. I was mad as hell. And after reading these books, I realized that I could change my own perception of the situation and circumstances that I was in. I couldn't change other people's perception and their understanding of what they thought they understood. Keep in mind, this is the most publicized case in the history of Washington, D.C. It is the most heinous and infamous case. They accused these men, and believe it or not, a young lady was actually charged with us also, ages ranging from 15 to 26. That's even more ridiculous. Because you know that a group of individuals ages 15 to 26 have so many different things unalike that they will not be hanging out together. But I said that to say we were mistreated in the prison system by the police as well as fellow inmates. They would urinate in our food. They were allowed to spit in our food. They were allowed to do anything, and people would say, "Don't eat that. Don't mess with that." And this went on because the case was tried in the newspaper and not in the courtroom. All the things that they wrote in the paper is not what was presented in the court of law. First of all, they did not know that there was no physical evidence linking any of these defendants to this heinous crime. They did not know that there was an actual perpetrator who had been seen running from the crime, who had been on the police radar for attacking and doing these type of attacks to women throughout the neighborhood. They didn't know that they had that in their file. They did not know that witness had seen this perpetrator running from the crime scene, but the government would keep it hidden away in their files. They did not know any of these things. And as a result, I went to prison for 26 years. We fast forward. I told you I decided to make that my place of higher learning. So I went to college. I did everything I wanted to do. I decided that I was going to change people's perception of me one way or another. So people went from not wanting to go to church with me, not wanting to go play basketball. If me or any of the guys on the case were on the basketball court, people would walk off. They walk off the foot. They didn't want to be associated with us in any shape, form, or fashion. Keep in mind, these are prisoners accused of the most unthinkable things who didn't want to be around us. By the time I left prison, people would not play basketball unless they could play for me or on my team.
Yes, sir.
People didn't want to do anything unless it included me. They included me in all their talks. They included me in all their programming. They wanted my name to be attached to everything that they were doing in the prison. Keep in mind, this scared the prison population. This scared the Bureau of Prisons. I spent 20 years working in Unicor in the federal prison system. Unlike the men in Angola, we worked in the factories. We didn't work on a plantation. We worked in the factory. I worked on everything from helmets for our military, the canteen, the parachutes that they used in the Gulf War, the Iraq War. I was responsible for quality control over those items. We made everything from the cables that they used for the missile launch codes. We made desks for the judges that sentenced us. We made chairs that they sit in. Everything that was made that the Department of Justice, Department of Defense have at their disposal was made by prisoners in the federal system. We fast forward. I spent 20 years doing this type of work. I helped work on the Marines' perfect shirt. They have a shirt that will not wrinkle no matter what you do. It fits the contour of their body. They didn't have it all right despite what they said, and we helped them get it right. And I was paid a total of 92 cents an hour. The most you can make was $1 an hour. When I was released from prison, after the convincing a parole board, I'm the first person to go up in front of the U.S. Parole Commission and convince them of my innocence without admitting guilt. We introduced my innocence to the parole board prior to going into the courts, and they released me. But when I was released from prison, I was released from Atwater, California, maximum security prison. And like Shawn said, they can get a hold of cell phones in prisons, but unlike where I was at, maximum security prisons, cell phones go for a minimum of $2,200. So I did not have access to a cell phone. I did not get access to a cell phone until after I was released from Atwater, California. They had an inmate at the camp drive me to the bus station and drop me off. They gave me $50 in a bus ticket to get from Modesto, California to Washington, D.C. Needless to say, I missed my bus. Not one time, several times. They wanted to blame it on everybody. The problem was I had no way of communicating, so I convinced the young lady to get me a cell phone to show me where I could get a cell phone. So I used that $50 to get a cricket phone, and I thought I had unlimited talk, unlimited text for 30 days. Nobody told me that it needed to be charged. So I thought I got ripped off because the phone cut off. Nobody told me how to turn the phone on. So I missed 3 buses on my way back here. And my mom, everybody, I'm calling everybody, and nobody's calling me back. They blaming Shawn. Shawn wasn't in the country. They blaming all my other attorneys, and like, we got to get Chris on a plane. But as you heard Shawn and Amy talk about, I can't get on a plane. I don't have identification. I don't have ID. So my man says, stop panicking. Don't worry about it. You're going to get there. But you're not getting on a plane, Chris. Nobody's sending you a plane ticket because you can't fly. You don't have no identifications. So he told me, wherever you at, just find a Walmart. I don't care where you was at. So I was in Modesto, California. No, I was in Deming, New Mexico now. Stranded. Trying to get back. I'm wondering why nobody's calling me back on the phone, but no one told me to turn the ring on. So those are some of the things that you face, uphill battles of exoneree being released from prison and having to navigate the waters back into society. No one told us about inflation. So when I go to get a bottle of water and M&Ms and the guy's telling me like $7, I'm like, hold on, I'm not a tourist. I'm not paying that for no water and M&Ms. But I left in 1984 when you could get that stuff for less than 50 cents. So I journeyed on now. And so with the help of the MAPE Innocence Project, I get a chance to do a lot of incredible things for men and women that's coming behind me. I get a chance to help exonerees and people who are not exonerees come behind me to navigate the waters that I had to navigate. We have an opportunity now. We help people under the Mandela Project that we established. I help people with getting jobs. We help people learn the simple things as tying a tie. You got to remember these guys left when they were kids. So people don't know how to tie ties. We got to teach people how to get on the internet. And as Shawn was telling you about the things that's missing, we actually take people down there to fill out the forms to go get their ID, to go get your benefits. They tell the people, just go down there, get your birth certificate and all, go get your Social Security card. People don't know where to go at to get it. It's people that live in the city that don't know where to go at to get them things. So how's somebody who's been gone 30 years supposed to know where to go at? But we take them down there, we take them and we remind them of patience. Just be patient. We're going to walk you through the process. We're not going to leave you. We're not going to abandon. We're going to walk you through the things. And we take people to go get their first meals. Most people want to pick McDonald's or somewhere they think, no, you're not getting a McDonald's meal. Pick something else. We want you to get some real taste of food. We take people and show them where to go. But we're asking the Bureau of Prisons and other agencies, because you're already a government agency, these things should be in a person's file, period, because you know who you have there. So his birth certificate and his Social Security card, which he needs to get ID, should already be in his file prior to release, because you know for a fact that you got the person that you have there. You know who you arrested and who you've been keeping for the last 10 or 20 years. So we have no excuse why those things are not in a person's file prior to release. And so I thank all of you, because we get a chance to work toward changing laws that can impact these things. Again, we have to realize that mass incarceration is a lot of the obstacles and barriers that stand in the way of the things that we want to accomplish with the disparity. I believe Commissioner Ellis was talking about it earlier today about indigents. That number is never going to catch up with each other as long as mass incarceration is going on, because with mass incarceration, they have reinvented the wheel. You just think about where these prisons are at in rural areas where nobody is coming unless you have a prison. And once you have a prison there, now automatically that little Bates Motel that used to sit there with the little creaking doors now becomes a Hilton or a Marriott. That little Andy Griffith gas station is now going to become an Exxon or a Shell, because people have to travel a long distance to get there, and then they're going to have to stay overnight. So now they're building up the communities. They're giving jobs for the next 60 years, ensuring jobs for the next 60 years that don't require a whole lot of skills to keep somebody in prison. So you don't need a whole lot of real sharp minds to do that. So as a result, you're reinventing the wheel all over again under the disguise of mass incarceration. Thank you. That's my time. Appreciate it.
So much, Chris. It's very touching and also infuriating to hear about what you had to go through. Thank you. We don't have a whole lot of time left, which is okay. I wanted to give the floor to these panelists and let them have most of the time today because their work is what's important to this discussion. But kind of giving everything that we've talked about, heard today, I think the main question I want to pose to all of you is, in those states where statutes are not in place for compensation or the statutes are not good enough, how can we effectively push for a more holistic approach to compensation, including things like social services, employment assistance, even help with the release? Like Chris was mentioning, all those struggles. What do you all think about that? Are there any statutes that are the gold standard? Maryland seems to be really, really good, but can you all give us your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I would say one of the things that was really powerful about the experience in Maryland is that exonerees really led the charge. So the bill is named after an exoneree, Walter Lomax, who had been fighting for compensation for a long time. With the policy department at the Innocence Project, we put together press conferences with groups of exonerees who were sort of taking, their voice had been taken away, and they used their voice to advocate for change. And I think it was incredibly effective because legislators were seeing the people who needed this change. And many of those advocating for the legislation had already been compensated, but they saw the importance of it. And I think it was, unfortunately, it was the legislators were still able to ignore it for a bit, despite that. But it made it really hard for them to ignore.
I'll second what Shawn said. She said it, I think, better than I can, but it really does take a village to advance this legislation, and in a meaningful way, to make sure that it includes all of the provisions that we know are critical. So hearing from advocates, lawyers, researchers, exonerees, hearing all of those perspectives, and knowing your audience. Knowing their values, knowing what they will find persuasive, knowing what the counter arguments to the legislation will be, and sort of trying everything you can to diffuse those counter arguments. And the last thing I'll say about this is, and maybe this was very naive of me, but the first time I testified, which incidentally was the first time I met Shawn, we had both been invited by a panel of folks to testify in favor of this bill. I did not realize, at least in Maryland, I suspect it's true in other states as well, anyone can testify in favor of these bills. So if you have knowledge in this area, if you have lived experience, if you have strong feelings about this, make your voice heard. Sign up to testify. Nobody has to invite you. Go on the General Assembly's website, find out when the hearing is, and voice your support.
I don't have anything to add.
Okay.
I think it's important that we understand, I didn't make this point, but to help with it, I think that affordable housing should be given to exonerees for the time that they spent in there. If you can't just give them, because you're doing it anyway. We're doing it for returning citizens anyway, affordable housing. So exonerees, if you spent 30 years in prison, you should be given affordable housing for 30 years. That's a bare minimum that we can do to help out offset some of this stuff.
Absolutely. So I also want to just acknowledge that this panel, their proficiency, their work is just excellent. Like, we have a practitioner, we have researchers, we have an advocate, It's truly collaborative. How would you all suggest that other people working in the space individually connect with advocates or researchers or practitioners to further the work and further the cause?
Since I work on a university, for me, it's about getting young people involved, getting students involved, because they're the next generation, and they have a lot of energy, and they have, at least where I am, students want to help, and I think getting young people involved is a great first step. And also, it's been said over and over again, but the importance of voting. I can't stress that enough. I stress that to my students as well. Vote, getting the right people in office that can make some of these changes happen.
I think connecting the people who are doing the work on the ground with the people who are doing really important research, more than just here, because there are now social workers at Innocence organizations who aren't necessarily in contact with people doing the research on the prevalence of trauma and stigma. And I think it's really important that these groups be brought together.
Yeah, and to that end, we need events like this one. We need conversations like this one, right, where we can learn from each other. And, it's very easy in our professional lives to become kind of siloed, whether you work at a university or an Innocence project or what have you. But we need to be sharing our research with the public and with people who can do something about it. Tell us what research you need. We'll go collect those data. So it really can be a very synergistic endeavor.
And might I add also, I think it's important to always include people with a lived experience. So I really appreciate that about this event. And I think more researchers need to do that as well. And I definitely agree. As a researcher, we can research whatever we want, essentially. And I don't know about you, but sometimes I'll ask people I know that work in the Innocence area, and I'll say, what should I do next? Because I want to do research that's going to have some sort of effect on policy and reform. So yes, if you are a practitioner or just a concerned community member, reaching out to have, and I'm not saying research changes much, but if there's enough of it and enough people are disseminating it in the right ways, then it can, help make some change.
Chris, we have an audience question for you.
Sure.
This person wants to know, should exonerees receive an apology? And if so, should it be written in public? By who? What do you think about this?
Definitely they should receive apology, and it should be a public apology, because most of them was done, the wrong happened in front of the public. So it should definitely be a public apology. But it's hard to get officials to take their head out the sand to even admit that these atrocities take place.
So we are getting close on time. One final question I have for all of you is, what is one action or task that everyone here, regardless of if they're a researcher, if they're a practitioner, if they're an advocate, what's one thing that everyone can do to help combat the issues that we've talked about today and support those who have been wrongfully convicted?
It's a tough one to end on.
It's a big ask, but I trust you guys. I think you can.
I would just say sharing the stories. When I teach wrongful convictions, it's shocking to me how many students don't know about wrongful convictions. That's changed a bit in the last 5 years due to, true crime podcasts and documentaries. But I think just exposure and, I think I think it's very rare to be able to listen to an exoneree tell their story and not feel compelled to do something. So I think just getting the stories out there.
I'd echo that. I think it's important to tell the stories. We've seen how much the stories have changed criminal justice policy. And I think telling the stories, every time I hear about Chris with his bus ticket, I was watching it basically from Morocco. You can't help but think that's not how it should happen, whether Chris did it or not, right? That's not how people should be treated. And so I think hearing the stories, ideally hearing them from the source.
Can I just add one caveat to what I said? Because I also want to point out that I don't think it's exonerees. I don't think that it's their responsibility to tell their stories, because not all exonerees want to, and I don't think the burden should be on exonerees. I think exonerees who find it therapeutic. So I just wanted to, because during my research, a lot of the people I spoke to talk about, you know, like, I don't like talking to researchers, and it's just very eye-opening that, you know, I don't think that anyone should feel like they have to. But I'm wondering, do you ever feel like you have to tell your story? You enjoy telling your story?
I enjoy telling my story, and it's actually educational. It actually show you that these things can take place. Not only with the Central Park case did it happen in New York, but it happened in D.C., and we have to wonder where else is it happening in the country. You know, this is not an isolated situation. These are real situations that are going on in our society, and in a society where we are moving forward, we should be willing to go back and fix injustices wherever they're at. Martin Luther King said, injustice anywhere is injustice everywhere. So we should be willing to go back and fix those injustices if we had the power and the ability to do so.
I agree with everything that's been said. And there's even research showing that the power of sharing these stories cannot be ignored. To that end, you know, everyone in this room is sort of blessed with knowledge about this topic that the average person doesn't have. So when we talk about this with people who aren't in our field and they're learning about it for the first time, that's very eye-opening for them. So have those conversations with your friends, your spouses, your kids, your neighbors, etc. You know, talk about these issues. The more awareness we have about this stuff, the better off we'll be. And to just briefly echo what Amy said about voting, obviously voting is important. Keeping tabs on, you know, politics is important. Keep tabs on your local elections too. You know, keep tabs on your local representative, your local senator, what policies they're supporting, and how you want to get involved.
Communicate with them.
Yes.
Because they get so much from the other side.
Well said.
Thank you to all the panelists, and thank you so much, Chris, for sharing.
Thank you.
With us too.
Thanks, everybody. That was wonderful. I know it's late. I know you're weary. I know your plans don't include me. Still, here we are. We're going to take a 15-minute break, come back for the last panel today, which, not to give too much away, but I think might be the single one change that we could make across the country that would do the most to prevent intentional prosecutorial misconduct. So you're going to want to stick around all the way to the end. Thanks.
Thank you.